Thank you very much, Billy, and thanks everyone. It's an honor to be here in this distinguished seminar series. Can everybody hear me? Good. Yes, and Billy has brought up one of the reasons why I'm here in terms of bringing some of these different marine lab activities together into one ring to rule them all, so to speak. At least that's one of the directions we're going, and I'll come back to that towards the end. I was a little bit alarmed when I was reminded of the title that I had given a few days ago, as sometimes happens in these situations. But it also made me think about the fact that when I gave this title to Julia a few months ago, this was a very sort of parochial academic kind of issue, whereas now I think it's suddenly become an existential idea for the future of democracy. I don't think that's really too much of an exaggeration, and we'll talk a little bit about that here. So, excuse me, the charge that that we were given for this series was to consider the question of, do we need data and what kind? And so my answer is yes, we do need data. So we can go to the refreshments now, I think. So obviously we need data. Nobody would argue with that. But now that we've cleared that up, I'd like to dig a little bit deeper, and first of all into what we mean by data. So there are many ways of thinking about this, of course. But basically what we're talking about is observations of the world. And we need those in order to make sense of the world around us. Recently this, as I say, has become more than an academic question because some of the very fundamental assumptions we had about what data and observations and cause and effect in the real world have been called into question. So one of the things that I'd like to focus on is the fact that in order to know things and to understand things, we need not just data, but we need interpretation. And those together make up science. So let's consider an example. And I'll just give you a preview that I'm going to answer how I'm going to answer my question that's posed here. And I hope that you will see why I answer it that way as we go along. So we'll consider an example about data and how we interpret it. Normally, we think of photographs as data. These are raw observations of the world. At least historically, they have been in this country. But it turns out that we also need science, that is interpretation of those data, because even with a clear photo, not everyone draws the same conclusion about that data. And in this country, as I say, we've historically taken it for granted that the press is above manipulating a photo, and that these are reliable data. But of course, that is not the case everywhere. And I think the contrast here illustrates what we sometimes perhaps didn't even realize until it's gone, or until it's threatened, is a sacred foundation of both science and democracy, and that is some agreement about what is objective truth. So throughout history, dictators have rejected the idea that photos are data and doctored them to remove people that are no longer in favor and so on. Stalin was quite fond of this. There are others as well. 2016 was named, Posttruth was named the word of the year by Oxford dictionaries. This is no longer a joke for late night TV. This is real. And it's an existential threat, as I said, to science, but also to democracy. I know many of you, all of you probably have been thinking about this and waking up in the middle of the night about it, so I'm not going to belabor it too much, except to say that what we're talking about here is important not just to science, not just to fisheries science, but to everything else. Without agreement on the basic rules of objective evidence and cause and effect in the universe, we're basically lost. And our institutions don't work. So we've got data. We have plenty of data. We might need more in certain circumstances, but a question of equal importance to whether we have data, whether we need data, what kind of data is what we do with it. And that requires this culture of reason applied to learning about cause and effect in the real physical world. This is not a new problem. Ray Hilborn has actually written a thoughtful essay about this. Most data are available to alternative explanations, and those are affected by our worldviews. Ray made the case in this essay on faith-based fisheries that our perceptions often color the way we interpret the data. But of course, this doesn't just apply to conservationists. This actually applies to everyone, and it's a very widespread phenomenon. And we've begun to see headlines like these in newspapers over the last few years. You've heard about this alarming phenomenon that many of the scientific results on which we base most of the important things we do, important public policies, even medical issues can't be replicated, and that is a problem. The problem of well, this is a bit separate from faith-based science, but in general, the issue is that we need better ways to really make sure that the scientific results that we have are robust and sound. So let's look at another example of how our worldviews influence science. And I hope you'll forgive me because I am not a fisheries scientist. It's a subject of great interest to me as a marine ecologist, as it has to be. But in reading about this, I realized that maximum sustainable yield has historically, at least, been the conceptual foundation of fishery management. And so how does this work in practice? How is a naive person like myself to learn about this? And so to find out, of course, I Googled it. And the curious thing is, if you Google MSY, you get pages and pages of these kind of diagrams here. So lots of schematics, but virtually no empirical data. What is a novice like myself to make of this? Well, I asked Alan Longhurst, not personally, but by reading this book, which I highly recommend if you haven't read it before, not just because of the somewhat sensational title. But basically, he, among many other things, has a quite interesting story of the history of MSY. It is an eminently plausible phenomenon. We know that populations grow and that the amount of production depends in some measure on the standing stock. These are almost like the syllogism of natural selection. They have to be true based on premises that we know to be true. It is so logical, in fact, that MSY was enshrined into law in the US with little, if any, empirical support at the time, according to Longhurst, and has remained that way ever since. So by this story, one would have to conclude that what was historically at least the central tenet of fishery science is also primarily faith-based. So it's a very interesting phenomenon when we get back to looking at how worldviews influence the way we practice this science. And I don't mean to be to overemphasize this. I realize that fishery science has progressed since the 1950s and the 1960s, and that we now have ecosystem-based approaches and so on. But I bring it up not to diss fisheries, but to highlight the inherent challenge we have of disentangling data and interpretation. So the question is, what can we do about this? How do we go forward knowing that our conclusions about data are often influenced by our worldviews? So I'm going to suggest something that we might call data democracy, and this involves both opening data up to a wide community of people, and in the process, secondly, having a collaborative process of interpretation in order to arrive at some consensual interpretation of the data. So there are 3 points that I will mention in its favor. One is that 7 billion heads are better than one. In general, we're probably not going to get everybody on Earth to join into this process, but the point is that having multiple perspectives is important and useful in interpreting data as opposed to one person. The second is that many hands make light work. I wanted to say 14 billion hands are better than 2, but that would actually be kind of unfair because you're not going to have that many hands. But the point is you can answer questions that are on far greater scales and that address qualitatively different problems with large collaborative networks than we often can on our own. And then finally, engagement with a large community breeds ownership. I couldn't figure out a more sort of elegant way of saying that. But this will be especially, I think, will resonate with those who are involved in citizen science. I'm thinking of Julia's COAST program and many others, where participating in science not only engages people in understanding that system, but also builds a sense of responsibility for it. And many of you will know this from working with fisheries management councils and so on. So a milestone in this process of accepting the larger global mind, so to speak, came with the creation of Wikipedia. Now, some of you, like me, are old enough to remember when this happened, and everybody thought it was a totally crazy idea, Wikipedia. Academics were all terrified because, you know, we thought this is crazy. Students are going to get lazy and will never read books. They'll go on the internet and they'll get all this crazy stuff that's written by, what did Donald Trump call them? Like, you know, 400-pound people in their basement somewhere. That was a different thing, but everyone was kind of worried about it. But in the end, it seems to have worked out okay. This was from an article in Nature in 2005, which some of you will remember this kind of blockbuster headline about when some experts had gone through and picked some number of articles and asked about the accuracy of those articles in Wikipedia versus in the Encyclopedia Britannica, which was sitting in this sacred space in my family's home from the time I was a little kid, the 1959 version, which was not all that useful when I was in high school in the late 70s. But at any rate, what they found is that the number of, well, for all practical purposes, that there was no clear difference in accuracy for the articles that they looked at between these two. And as we know now, we all look at Wikipedia, whether we admit it or not, right? So there's a lot to learn there. So what I'd like to do briefly here is to talk about 3 case studies of what I consider sort of nascent examples of data democracy. The first one is from the Reef Life Survey. The Reef Life Survey is a program that is the brainchild of Graham Edgar of the University of Tasmania, who I consider to be a visionary, actually. And basically, Graham was interested in whether the protected areas around Australia were working and what we might learn about the best ways to design them. Now, there are a lot of these, and to really get the answer to that, you have to do a lot of monitoring and measurements. And he recognized that it's going to be very difficult to get at that with scientists. We just don't have enough of them to get in the water. And so his idea was to, he recognized that there is a real resource, an untapped resource in recreational scuba divers and others. These are Aboriginal rangers from Australia that the group was working with. And that this untapped resource, these people have a lot of experience, enthusiasm, and local knowledge that's otherwise very difficult to get of the natural history. And so he figured that if you could take recreational divers and vet them carefully to get the really most responsible ones and train them well, that they could become marine scientists quickly. And he was in fact right. So basically, after completion of training, they found that the data produced by these volunteers, and these are visual surveys of fish and invertebrate diversity, abundance, and size, was basically the same as those from the trained scientists. So with that model in place, they went out and did a lot of dives themselves, trained a lot of other divers, and spread this model around the world. These are all in shallow scuba depth, rocky reef and coral reef areas. And they have completed over 1,800 sites, something like 4,500 surveys. This is a data set that would be essentially impossible to get in almost any other way. And it is data on species composition, abundance, and body size of fishes and macroinvertebrates in these systems. So it's among the most comprehensive marine biodiversity data sets out there. What can you do with that? Well, there have been a number of studies that have come out of this, and I'll just mention one that goes back to the original question Graham had about protected areas. And there's a lot of data here. What I'll just do is tell you essentially the answer. They basically looked at 87 different MPAs around the world and scored them based on a variety of characteristics. And bottom line was they found out that the answer is Neoli, N-E-O-L-I, that the best protected areas were no-take and forest, old, large, and isolated. Now, all of these make sense. We probably could have predicted many of these things in advance, but the point is that there was now very strong data for this. And the number of such features that you had in a given area, the more of those features you had, the better it was in terms of having big fish biomass diversity and so on. So the second case study I want to mention is what we call Ocean Bite Map. And this project was sort of born from interest in a fundamental question, which is basically about the trophic control of marine ecosystem structure and function. So what is driving this? At a fundamental level, marine ecosystems are forced by physics, or the abiotic environment. And we have a beautiful understanding and picture of this in part from the revolution in satellite oceanography that happened back in the 70s and so. This, of course, is the familiar global composite of ocean color converted into chlorophyll concentrations. And we see many of the features that we're familiar with from the ocean, the deserts in the central ocean basins, the equatorial upwelling, and so on. The reason I bring this up is that we now have a very detailed picture of bottom-up control within the ocean. But we have nothing like that for top-down control. We don't have a comparable map of the importance of predation or top-down processes, even though that we know that they're very important in some circumstances. So we were thinking about how would we get such a thing? Well, A, there's no way we're going to get it with this kind of resolution, but how might we take the example from Reef Life Survey and do this? So what we did was to come up with an idea for mapping the intensity of fish feeding, which we call Ocean Bite Map. And these little red dots here are a selection of most, but not all, of the sites where we were able to recruit partners to conduct a parallel experiment. And basically, we targeted seagrass beds because they are accessible in shallow water. We needed some kind of standardization, and we asked people to conduct an assay of fish feeding intensity, which I'll show you in a moment, and to assess the fish community there. So we have about 40 places. Basically, the assay consists of what we call Squid Pops. There's a hashtag for that. And it's nothing more than a tomato steak with a little piece of dried squid tethered to the end of it. Put 25 of these things out in the water. Takes you a little less than an hour to do that. At the end of an hour, you go by and count them all to see how many have been eaten. Then leave them in the water 24 hours later, come back and count them again. 0, 1. They're either there or they're gone. By doing that, we get a number somewhere between 0 and 25 of the intensity of fish predation at 1 in 24 hours. And this turns out to be, despite its simplicity, reasonably powerful and allowing us to discriminate among different places. So at the same time, what we did in each of these sites is to take a standardized seine haul and count and identify and measure the fishes, both in a seagrass bed and in an adjacent unvegetated sediment. This project is underway right now, so I only have preliminary results that are, if you will, a proof of concept. But what we find is that so far, with about 20 to 25 sites reporting in, we see a kind of an interesting pattern. Let's first look on the right. This is the bait loss after 24 hours, and we see that there's a very strong latitudinal trend in the seagrass beds, but interestingly, not a clear trend in the unvegetated sediment. There's a lot of scatter around these, and I'm not sure that I will attribute a lot to the exact forms of these now. But we are still seeing now with some of the southern hemisphere sites beginning to report in, we're seeing that pattern strengthened. On the side of the fish communities, right now we just have looked at the species richness, and interestingly we find sort of a different pattern here, where there's not very much difference across latitude and species richness of fishes, whereas there is in the sediment. So, as I say, this is a little bit of a proof of concept showing that it's possible to do this, that we do start to get patterns, and I'll mention that without showing the data, we also get very strong patterns among habitats. We've done a bunch of this in tropical areas, and as you would expect, there's very strong feeding on reefs, much less so out in adjacent unstructured habitats. So we believe that this will be workable as a way to at least get some sense of fish feeding activity around the world. So the third case study I'll mention is from the Zostera Experimental Network. For those who don't know, Zostera is the genus of eelgrass, and which is the most widely distributed plant in the northern hemisphere. And we gathered a group of intrepid ecologists, including Jen Rusink, here in Washington State, to join together. And our efforts were really stimulated by, again, a very general question like that I asked for top-down control, which is what controls sort of the major structural and functional characteristics of eelgrass ecosystems? What is the relative importance of bottom-up and top-down control? These are questions that are very important in management, for example, because eelgrass is threatened in many places, and that is at least in part due to eutrophication, sediment loading, and so on, but also has been suggested to be due to fishing that has changed the food web structure, for example, in the Baltic. So what we did was to design a very simple top-down, bottom-up experiment fertilization crossed with grazer exclusion, and we got groups all around the world to join with us in this. I think there's Jen right there. We had colleagues all the way from Norway down to Portugal and Quebec to North Carolina and so on. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail of what we found, but and the experiment has already been published, but I'll show you some results of the second generation of Zen where we expanded out to 50 sites, and basically have found that, well, what I'm showing here are some of the major patterns that we're seeing. So in this analysis, we did standard sampling of the plant structure, the eelgrass structure, the associated algae and invertebrates and so on. And we had a bunch of environmental indicators and asked what is driving these patterns. And to my surprise and somewhat to my distress, we basically found very little strong evidence of abiotic forcing, and that may be due in part to the coarseness of the abiotic variables. But what we find again and again is that the strongest indicators of eelgrass structure, biomass, canopy height, shoot density, and so on, is geography. That is latitude as well as the differentiation among the coasts, West Pacific, East Pacific, West Atlantic, East Atlantic. And so if we look at the endpoints of this, what we have are eelgrass forests around here on the west coast. This particular one is from British Columbia, where we have stands of eelgrass that are 3 meters high and really thick blades and relatively sparse shoots, to what we have in the Chesapeake Bay, which are these very thick, short turfs, more like meadows. So even though this is one species of plant across this large range, it has very different structural characteristics. So geography is a big predictor. It's a little bit unclear whether that is reflecting differences in the abiotic environment or differences in the colonization history of eelgrass into those oceans, because the genetic structure is very different in these places. So this is a really interesting question as we go forward. We did find some answer to our initial question of bottom-up versus top-down forcing. For example, if we look across these 50 sites in the Atlantic, which are blue, and the Pacific, which are green, we find that the secondary production as measured by the total biomass of crustaceans in the, such as these amphipods and so on, is significantly predicted by our proxy for nitrogen availability, which is the nitrogen content of the plants. And that also differs among these geographic regions, with the East Pacific having the highest values of both nitrogen and crustacean biomass. So it's worth thinking a little bit about why this shouldn't work. And these will probably already be in your mind. We've heard these a number of times. So there are some good reasons why it shouldn't work. If the data are just all distributed everywhere, the bad guys will have the data. So this is perhaps less of a problem for, say, eelgrass biomass than it is for the emails of the Democratic National Committee. There are cases where you don't want the data everywhere. We probably don't want everyone in the world to know where the last rhinos are, because they'll go away. So just hold that thought for a minute. Secondly, there's no quality control if it's just out there and everybody has it. This is certainly a significant issue. There has to be quality control no matter where the data are before they're released to the wide world. And of course, we know that many of the data sets that are going out to the wide world that are open data go through a very rigorous process of quality control before they're released. That's important. So that we need to do that. And then one of the issues for scientists, of course, is I don't want to release my data because I'll get scooped. This is a legitimate concern, and you know, NSF and other bodies deal with this in part by allowing an embargo before the data are required to be public. So I think those are generally good solutions. I also wonder if we haven't worried a little bit too much about that. So you know, those of us who have collected particular data know more about it than anyone else does and how to interpret it. And so in general, we've got a jump on getting that data published in the right way. And by putting it out in public, we then have the opportunity for that to keep on giving, so to speak. So these are all subjects that could require a lot of discussion. But I think in general, the answer to this was well put by Winston Churchill, who said that democracy is the worst form of government except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. I think this is actually a really profound statement. Democracy has a lot of problems. We've seen some of them lately. But it's hard to figure out how you change it substantially without making it even worse. Just something to think about. So to come back to the original question, can data democracy save the world? I know this is what you've been waiting for. I'm going to answer this with an emphatic maybe. It's at least worth a try, and obviously it's already being tried in the sense that there is a very strong movement towards open data availability. NSF requires that. For example, there's a neuroscience initiative that's just opened up everything. I believe that's in Montreal, and others are doing this. So we're in an experimental phase of trying to figure out how to make this work. And this is one of the goals of the Smithsonian's MarineGEO program, which, as Billy said, is a collaborative partnership where what we are trying to do is focus on a type of ecosystem and marine system that has been somewhat neglected by the large ocean observing programs, and that is the diversity of marine life in very shallow nearshore waters, essentially between the intertidal and scuba depth. And obviously there are lots of people working on those systems, but what I mean by that it's been neglected is that up until now there has not been a strong standardized system of bringing those data together in order to answer larger questions. And that's what we'd like to do. So this kind of came home to me when I was preparing for the Ocean Sciences meeting last year in 2016. And when you submit your abstract, you're required to tick off some key phrases. So I was looking in vain for key phrases that actually applied to what I wanted to talk about, which was biodiversity. And as I did this, I decided to take all of the words in those key phrases and do a word cloud. And this is what I came up with. So, you know, you can see a lot of important things here: climate, ocean, processes, modeling, and so on. What you don't see is biodiversity or even ecology. Oh, sorry, there it is. So we have ecology and community, two very little words that are in fact about the same size as software and semantic. Is it just me? I mean, something's wrong with this picture. And I realize biology involves, there's probably phytoplankton in there, I'm not sure. But anyway, that got me thinking about this and brought home the message that there really is a need for a more focused approach in marine science on biodiversity, whatever one might want to call it, species composition of key functional groups, and so on. And in fact, this was a major point of the decadal ocean survey of ocean research, which I didn't put in here. But at any rate, so biodiversity is central to what we are trying to do in MarineGEO. And to give you a very simplistic sort of diagram of this, what we're interested in is the bidirectional relationships between abiotic environmental forcing, biodiversity, very broadly speaking, to mean the richness and composition, functional and taxonomic, of organisms there, and ecosystem processes, productivity, nutrient cycling, carbon sequestration, and so on. This can be approached both through modeling of observational data and experiments, and both of those are part of what we have in mind and what we're doing. The ocean bite map and Zen are both examples of the kind of approaches that we're taking in these coordinated experiments and modeling. The way we're doing that is by building out from the Smithsonian's own marine field stations, shown in yellow here, Chesapeake Bay, Florida, Belize, both coasts of Panama, and engaging with partners with similar interests in other institutions, such as University of Washington. We're working with Billy et al. At Friday Harbor, the Hackeye Institute in British Columbia, and several others here. These are sites where some part of our MarineGEO research program has started, which basically is focusing initially on regular monitoring, at least annually, of foundation species, fishes, and an invertebrate inventory in each of these sites. Seagrass beds, kelp beds, coral reefs are some of the major habitats where we're working. There has been some degree of opportunism in which sites have come on, but strategically what we're interested in, as you can begin to see, is building out along the coasts of the two Americas, ultimately we hope from pole to pole, so that we can look at major Earth system gradients, latitudinal gradients, climate gradients, but also along another axis, building out so that we can look at gradients of human influence, both from, say, polluted harbors out to more pristine areas, also inside and outside of protected areas or other areas differing in fishing impact, for example. And so that's where we are going, and we would be delighted if you come there with us and we all work together. And I'm just going to leave it there. So thank you very much, and be happy to answer questions. Yes.
Thanks. So at the beginning of the talk, you drew a nice distinction between sort of the collection and management of data and the analysis and interpretation of data. And you've given us some examples of the democratization and collection of data. And I agree that everybody should help me collect my data. But aren't there some additional dangers that we didn't address here when we democratized the interpretation of data? Among other things, we're going to introduce people who have a stake in the outcome, people who might be willing to fudge the data and put out results that are supported by cherry-picked data or just false data points. My data there is, let's look at climate change, let's look at vaccines. Those really be quite destructive. How do we manage that?
Well, you know, one of the I brought up the question about what happens when the bad guys get the data. Well, you know, one way to sort of a counter to that is, what if the bad guys are the only ones who have the data? And I'm not implying that we do, but you know, to my mind, you know, I think the most, maybe I'm being naive, I was going to say the most robust way of addressing those kind of questions is to let people have at it, and let there be a you know, a widespread analysis of this, and let people draw their own conclusions. You know, the kinds of things that you're bringing up, the vaccines and autism and that sort of thing, for example, seems to thrive perfectly well in the absence of data. So it's not clear to me that putting the data out there is going to make that worse. I'm not sure if I've answered your question. Is it? Okay. But yeah, I mean, clearly there are going to be some situations where there is actual danger in putting data out. And so, you know, it's not a panacea.
Well, sort of taking off on that a little bit, I'm amazed at how different information can look depending on how you scale a graphic. So if you have fish data for a long period of time, you may come to the conclusion that, gee, it varies over time, they go up, they go down. Pick a particular decade and, oh my God, the population is crashing, things are terrible. And I think the only answer there is not only to have the graphic, but have the data available for people to look at. And some people can say, yeah, you were pretty selective in the little section that you had. But I mean, most people aren't going to go back over the whole data set. They're just going to say, you know, oh, everything's fine, or oh, things are terrible. But I don't know any answer other than making the whole data set available.
Right. Most people aren't going to, but if somebody sees that and gets mad enough and it's available, they might. And we all know of examples where that's happened. In answer to the question, I also go back to the Wikipedia thing, is that, you know, many of us thought this is going to be a disaster. You know, there's going to be all kinds of misinformation out there, and there is. You know, it's a little bit quaint actually now to think about it as, you know, with Wikipedia, since we have all these deliberately false news sites. Yeah, my personal feeling, maybe this is faith-based, is that the good that comes out of that is greater than the harm, which sometimes there is harm, on average.
So I would say that maybe it's not so much a question of whether we should hold data cards as much as, but how we should think about creating and advancing interpretation tools in an age of really fast information.
Mm-hmm.
And so rather than defaulting to, we just want to give you good information, maybe we really need to think about how we do our interpretation, our education, outreach.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's all about interpretation, because we're now in a situation where the bad guys are going to have the data whether we give it to them or not. You know, they already have our credit card numbers, for the most part. You know.
I'd like to follow up on the maximum sustained yield a little bit.
I thought you might.
Well, I correspond with Aldo Longhurst quite regularly, and actually he also says that there is no evidence that human activity is increasing the climate except the models themselves.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
He's written he's basically a very strong climate skeptic, and has written a book where he basically argues that if it wasn't for the models, we wouldn't have any belief that carbon dioxide was causing the Earth to warm. But I mean, what I don't understand is the empirical evidence is enormous that if we fish too hard, there are few fish and there's no sustainable yield.
Mhm.
And if we don't fish at all,
Mhm.
we don't catch anything. And that therefore, every bit of empirical data we have suggests that yield goes up and comes down. So is it that is the question, or is it that we should actually, our objective should be the maximization of that?
Okay, so I get that if there are no fish, you can't have any yield. And I also get that when you are at carrying capacity, there's not any appreciable yield. So yeah, I certainly would not argue with that. I mean, clearly there is some intermediate fish biomass where you can fish.
Fishing pressure is
Oh, sorry, fishing pressure. Yeah, I agree with that. I think my point, and this really is coming from trying to find the graphs, and I've had some conversations of the empirical data, and I've had some conversations with people saying, well, here's why you wouldn't expect to see those. But what I think the issue is the importance of bringing in other factors besides simply the fishing pressure and the biomass. And again, I don't mean to imply that people don't know that. I'm really thinking about the historical development of that concept.
I just say that one of my favorite quotes, John Gallant, who was the guru of fisheries in the 60s, he prepared this for an FAO conference as a joke and said, maximum sustainable yield set by biologists not to exist, set by economists to be irrelevant if it did exist, in short, the most important concept in fisheries management.
There you have it. Yes.
Now, we could continue the MSY debate by saying that if we ever saw a graph that did have the data points on them, they'd be fudged. Because the curve doesn't actually exist in the real world. So
Well,
we could discuss that another day.
This is partly
What
where I'm
more
coming from.
interested in is democratization of data analysis. So there are many once we get our data out there, how do we get, in an ecological or fisheries management sense, these sort of consensus statements that we see out of other communities that aren't just petitions? We see enough petitions sign up, we need more NPAs, we need whatever. How do we actually get communities to analyze data sets to avoid the bad guys' view getting out there, getting the general consensus of what these things are? Getting the data out is somewhat easier than getting the analysis.
Yeah, that's a good question. Two thoughts. One, in a very sort of specific logistical approach to it, is we can publish our scripts, and people are doing that right now. So that doesn't democratize it per se, but at least it shows exactly what you did with the data, so that somebody who actually understands that can come back and say, oh, why did you make this assumption? Or no, this is wrong. So that's in a sort of operational way. That's one thing that can help. That was not there before, right? The second thought is this is probably really difficult to do, to get people to agree on things like this, but we at least have a model in the form of the IPCC, for example. And there are other communities that are beginning to take that kind of an approach to say, okay, when we say very likely, we mean there is, by our estimation, models, or expert opinion, whatever it is, between an 80 and a 90% chance that this is true. Whatever the numbers are, that's one way. You still have to get everybody in the same room and to talk to each other and to sort of reach consensus on that. But I think that's a frontier.
My sense is that the current culture is that the interpretation is more importantly, is more rewarded than generating data itself. Do you think we can or should change that culture in such a way that good data sets are rewarded directly?
Absolutely. Yes, I'm in the business of collecting data. Well, yeah, I do. And I've done meta-analyses, and I've worked with people who do almost nothing other than meta-analyses, and I've worked with people who become apoplectic at the idea of somebody else meta-analyzing their data. So I think some of you probably know who I'm talking about. I think meta-analysis and modeling of these large data sets has been critical in giving us insights into ecology that we didn't have before, or at least confirming or denying insights that we thought we had before. But you obviously can't do that if you don't have the data, if the data don't exist. So how do we do that? I think one of the suggestions that I've heard that I think makes a lot of sense is for data sets to have a DOI. Is it DOI? Yeah, digital object identifier, so that they can be cited. And to encourage journals to make sure that when papers are cited, that the data set is cited. And one of the things that could be really valuable here, what seems simple to me since I'm not running a journal, is that, or citation services, for citation services to count the supplementary information citations in addition to the ones that are in the main body of the text. Because when you do a meta-analysis and you have to cite 423 papers that reported that data, those papers were absolutely critical to what you did. They should definitely get a citation credit for that, and yet they often don't because they're in a supplement. So that would be one concrete way that could happen to start.
Not really familiar with marine science and fisheries management, but from a meteorological aspect, you have academia, government, or any sort of publicly owned entity, private industry. And in meteorology, there's a lot of crossover between those three as far as collecting observations, getting data, but just any sort of scientific exploration. What do you see as the role of the private industry in kind of establishing this data democracy for marine science?
That's a very interesting question. I'll just start by saying I don't know, but it brings to mind. Many of you probably are aware of this interesting new resource that's being developed, the ecological marine units by Esri, and USGS is involved as well. They don't have it for the coastal zones yet, but it's a mapping of sort of ocean ecosystems in 3 dimensions based on abiotic environment. I don't know the details. I understand that some of that is going to be made available for free, but Esri is a private company, and ArcGIS is a product that one has to pay for. And these are businesses. They have to make money. They have to pay for their expenses somehow. So I think there really is a question of to what extent we rely on proprietary software and other kinds of products, you know, I think that there are some fundamental challenges there. Yeah. With all the data that exists today, is that what you're asking?
If I'm a scientist, do I choose to reanalyze somebody's old data set, or do I choose to collect new data to answer the question?
Well, I'm tempted to say, you know, if you want to get tenure and grants and advance in your job, you should never reanalyze somebody's data. You should do new stuff. I'm being a little bit cynical. There is, you know, as that headline about data are not reproducible, you know, was getting at, there is a real need to, well, reanalyze data, particularly that there's a lot of data out there that has not actually made it into a publication. It depends on what the question is. You know, some questions are the answers are reasonably well settled, and there's probably not a lot of need to redo them. There are also a lot of data that were published some time ago when the, you know, available sort of approaches for analyzing them were much less sophisticated than they are today. And so in those cases, you can get some really valuable new insights from doing them. But, you know, I don't want to sound wishy-washy, but obviously there are reasons both for collecting new data and for reanalyzing old data. And a lot of it depends on what the particular question is. There's still lots of things we would like to know that there's very little data available for.